Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister, the Effigy of the Indies. By Gert Matchell and Theo Blakenzy. First chapter. The new member of the London Association for Air Travellers. The chairman of the London Air Travellers Association, Sir Warren, walked briskly to and fro in the tastefully decorated clubhouse, while a gentleman, like himself dressed in sports suit, who had a glass of warm grog standing beside him, with a scornful glance followed with eyes. "You can say what you like, Mr. Huglipch. If your reasoning were valid, the terrible misfortune on our Nike would not have passed. You'll have to admit yourself that the steering gear wasn't right. Indeed, the descent could not have been more unfortunate. It was still very fortunate that the brave gentleman ended up in the pines, otherwise they would have been in bad shape. But the Nike is in tatters and we can wait a long time before we have a usable balloon back." "Listen, Sir Warren," replied the other gentleman, who was captain and engineer of the London Club. "After all, the whole accident is surely my fault. If you need a scapegoat, find someone but me. Or do you not remember how often I warned the two gentlemen not to take off with the test machine with their little experience?" But the two hotheads did not listen to good advice. Yes, replied the chairman, "I have advised them against it myself, and so have you. That is true. But, Captain, you will have to admit that the rudder failed." Captain Huglipch slammed his fist on the table, took his pipe from his mouth, and said, "Sir Warren, leave me alone with your accusations now, understand? To this misfortune is, if I do it can say frankly, no one else is guilty but yourself, my dear. Had you allowed me the necessary funds when I asked for it, the much too weak rudder would have been replaced by a more solid arrangement according to this drawing. This is my view of the matter, sir, and I can give you the proof. I forbid you, therefore, to make any further accusation, which could have the sole purpose of discrediting my reputation and detracting from my abilities as an aeronautical engineer. Otherwise you would force me to take a completely different tone with you, and to resign from the club without delay. My drawings and plans are all in order. If anything is wrong here, it is most certainly the board of the club, which never has the cash in hand at the right time. You and your fellow board members may well take these words to heart." After these words, the captain took a long gulp from his toboggan glass, wrapping himself in heavy clouds of tobacco. "I prefer not to be addressed in this tone," exclaimed the chairman indignantly. "If you weren't known for being a big brat, Captain Huglipch, I should blame you for your words. Now, however, I don't get offended by you. Your rude language leaves me cold." "What, I'm a clumsy? And my words leave you cold? Did I get the £1,000 I needed for the steering gear or not? Have the gentlemen made the journey with the testing machine, or not? I beg you to answer me." The fat club president shrugged. "I don't understand why you get so worked up. You, as captain, should not have given permission for the journey. It's true, we didn't grant your request, but we couldn't. There is no money in the till. I don't want to blame you anymore. Let us make peace, Huglipch." Sir Warren approached the captain and extended his hand, into which he placed his hesitantly and grumbling. The president took a chair and spoke in a whisper. "The main thing is that we have our balloon ready for takeoff as soon as possible, or else the whole club will go to the ground. This misfortune has frightened all fellow members and we could very easily lose our most influential members." "I don't like those donkeys," cried Huglipch, beating on the table. "They want to stick their noses in our business, And if I say we need £1,000 for a rudder, they have no right to shrug, they must provide the money. One should be ashamed of the Germans, who are willing to pay millions for their Zeppelin. It is hard to believe that Englishmen can be so stingy. But it probably isn't. I think there must be a lot of money in the coffers. The president scratched his ear. A cursed little bit, Captain, he replied. You're right, the association is devilishly stingy, and now the shell is in tatters too. How we will pay for all this is a mystery to me. Ho ho ho. The aeronaut laughed mockingly. That belongs to you. At first the affair could be solved with £1,000, but now it costs at least 7,000 or 8,100, not 10,000. That cannot yet be determined. And the money must be raised, if the London Club of Airships, and that would be a disgrace to England, shall perish. The president looked concerned. A lucky trip would have brought us many new members. So I finally let the two enthusiasts go through with their plan. But now this accident, how do we get money? Cursed noose we have. Captain Huglipch nodded with a mocking smile. Now you finally confess that it is your fault. Bravo. Now the watchword is, money, or rather gold. Check your cashier, Warren. There is no recovery without money. Let the lords and big manufacturers show up, for they have enough. Let them uphold England's honor. Open a begging party for the good of the country, and don't stop until you have collected at least £10,000. Brr. It sounded dismayed from Sir Warren's lips. But I see no other way out, unless the gold is sent to us from heaven. At this moment an attendant of the club entered the room and handed the president 2 business cards. Drums! Exclaimed Sir Warren in a low tone, could these perhaps be 2 angels from heaven? Mr. William P. Shaw, Chicago, Mr. Robert Bentley Shaw, Chicago. Captain, isn't that the world-famous billion-dollar firm? You must squeeze it, President. You understand that art masterfully, by the way, I must confess that. If we had those 2 in our group, our Nike would soon be ready again. That's for sure. The 2 club members exchanged a knowing look. Then Sir Warren rose, he was now the president of the club from head to toe, and spoke in a lively tone. Of course, with the greatest pleasure. Let the gentleman in. The servant opened the door. A middle-aged gentleman, of tall, slender stature, and of genuine American appearance, accompanied by a young gentleman, entered the room, where both were greeted very kindly by the president. My cousin and I, the elder began, are particularly interested in aviation. We've heard so much good about your system that we'd like to see the Nike, if it's all right with you. Sir Warren cursed fate. Captain Huglipch, meanwhile, had risen too, and grumbled. Very unfortunate, impossible right now. The president worked hard to get Mr. Introducing Huglipch as the inventor of the Nike system and as captain and aeronautical technician of the Farina King. Mr. Shaw from Chicago, whether he was a billionaire or not, was delighted and shook hands with the good engineer again and again. No, Robert, it is very fortunate, he said to the young man whom he had introduced as his nephew, that on our first visit we should be able to meet the genius inventor of the Nike system that far surpasses all others. That is delicious. Captain Huglipch blushed like a schoolgirl at those words of praise and at the handshakes of the famous Chicago man. He listened with innate modesty, always befitting of great inventors, to the words of the American who had by storm won the heart of the rude captain. When at last the nobleman wiped away a secret tear at the president's account of the misfortune that had befell the Nike, Sir Warren, too, was delighted with him. Mr. Shaw, at the invitation of Huglipch, examined the existing drawings and was full of enthusiasm and admiration for the airship's plan. It was not even necessary for the president of the club to propose that he become a member of the London Society. When it comes to supporting human inventions of the first rank, exclaimed the American fervently, the Chicago Shaws have never been left behind. If you allow it, Mr. Chairman, we will join as members immediately, won't we, Robert? I am applying for my nephew and myself, to make a small donation toward the repair of genius Mr. Huglipch's unsurpassable Nike, in the amount of $10,000, provided, with my nephew himself to experience a tour of the highly esteemed London Club. I also hope that the foremost aeronaut of the present day, as I venture to call Captain Huglipch, will be willing to give me further details in the field of aviation. It would make me very happy if I could drive this mode of transport of the future on my own." Captain Huglipch looked down before him, red as a turkey cock. The chairman, however, beaming with joy, held out his hands first to Mr. Shaw and then to his cousin Bentley Shaw from Chicago, and welcomed them both as fellow members of the London Club, which considered it a great honor to have such distinguished, sensible and modern-to-take-thinking lords from free America into its midst. Mr. Shaw at once, with great pleasure, paid the not insignificant entrance fee in American gold, and gave Sir Warren a check for $10,000 into the Bank of England, which the latter happily accepted. The President and Captain Huglipch promised, almost swore, that the Nike would be repaired without delay. In place of the now tried rudder, the completely reliable steering gear, according to Huglipch's plans, would be installed, despite the high costs involved. In this case, the captain was responsible for flawless operation when descending. To their great regret, the two Americans did not have much time. They soon parted, having promised to pay several visits in the next few days, and the two club mates remained alone, almost drunk with happiness. Second chapter. A pray for help to Lord Lister. The members of the London Airships Association would certainly have been more than astonished if they had seen the conduct of their worthy chairman. For scarcely had the Americans, under much bowing from Sir Warren and Captain Huglipch, left the clubhouse before these two worthy gentlemen fell into each other's arms and performed together a dance which could not be determined with any degree of certainty whether it was an Indian war dance or an Indian war dance, to propose an improved cakewalk. But the two Americans, too, looked at each other with a smile as they walked briskly through the southwestern part of the giant city on the Thames, where the Club of Airships had its clubhouse and balloon hall. They proceeded by electric tram to the western part of London, where the older of the two gentlemen lived in a fine country house. It was meanwhile afternoon, and as they passed the building of one of the great newspapers, the newsboys rushed madly on foot or by bicycle in all directions, exclaiming in a loud voice, "A new land of Raffles! Raffles, the great unknown! Scotland Yard tricked, the cigar case as a bomb! The master thief disappeared!" The two Americans looked at each other with a smile. "Hello, boy!" cried the eldest, "I must read that. A devilish fellow, that Raffles. What do you say, Sach, drums? I mean Cousin Robert from Chicago. I have to get used to that first. Say, Uncle Shaw, you know what I marvel at? How would those clever reporters manage to dish up that affair in all its details again to the reading public?" The American uncle laughed as he paid for the paper and the Raffles article flew on. "I understand how they get it, Robert. A good friend of Inspector Baxter's did that, and we shouldn't have to look too far from Scotland Yard. But tell me, Edward." Shh, my boy. Not so immodest. My name is Shaw from Chicago until further notice, and that's it." Lord Lister, for it was he, squeezed his adopted cousin's ear with a smile. "Well, dear uncle. After all, we are now among us. But what for heaven's sake do you want to do with the honest members of the Aviation Association? I don't understand that very well, and the amount you have allowed them seems to me a bit too high for an ordinary joke, taking into account our emaciated cash. Excuse me if I sometimes go too far out of great anxiety, but—" "Well, Charlie, you're right, it wasn't a fair thing really. But circumstances may arise, under which it is very helpful for Raffles to be acquainted with the latest inventions of modern science. A guy like Raffles has to know everything and even be able to pilot an airship in an emergency. By the way, I am not wholly inexperienced in the field of technology, for although for me, as a lord's son, technical studies were but an afterthought, and we at Eton and Pryford were chiefly sporting, yet with my not already too bad brains benefited more than one might think. I'll finish my studies now, and I've got plans of my own, which I'll tell you in due course." "And I?" asked Charlie curiously. "I am particularly interested in those things. I will do my best to learn the secrets of aviation." "It speaks for itself. I think you'll soon find out. Now, we'll see." The West End electric tram approached and took the two gentlemen at the usual speed to the stop near their villa. With hasty steps they both walked under the old trees and past the flowering shrubs to the small, but pleasant, comfortable and lavishly furnished country house, which was almost completely hidden from the eyes of passers-by by the greenery. At this moment a man, who seemed to have been waiting outside the house, came with hasty strides towards the two gentlemen. Disappointed, however, he stopped close to them, removing his hat with an apology. "I thought I saw acquaintances, gentlemen. But I see that I was mistaken." He was already about to leave with a polite bow. Lord Lister patted him on the shoulder and spoke. "Don't you, Fred, we've disguised ourselves well. By the way, I also made every possible effort not to disgrace my master in the makeup of Drury Lane Theatre." And addressed to Charlie, he continued. "How do you think that, Charlie? The good Fred doesn't even recognize us. That is extremely flattering." The old valet was dumb with surprise and stared open-mouthed at the two gentlemen. Thereupon, however, he seized the hand of his beloved young master, whom he had already carried on his arm as a boy, and pressed a kiss on the white fingers with emotion. "Fred, Fred," laughed the Lord kindly, "when Mr. Baxter of Scotland Yard saw you kiss the greatest criminal's hand. Oh, dear, good Lord. Lucky I know better. I know that you help all the afflicted and that your so-called crimes are but the punishments which thou layest upon the law-protected rogues. And well, my dear, good Lord, you have the right to do so. For have I not seen with my own eyes how the loan sharks and leeches did not leave the poor Admiral, your rough but kind-hearted father, a happy or quiet moment until he was at a loss for what to do and took refuge in the pistol? And all this was only the work of our Admiral's younger brother, who is now Lord Lister of Castle Caneroon. All knew this. It was very easy, after all, to stir and lie behind the Admiral's back when he tarried on the distant seas. Yes, yes, Lord Edward, ruffians have stolen from you your rightful inheritance, and you are 100 times right in avenging yourself. And if there are honest men in the jury when it comes to that, I assure you, and I will testify for you, while I am yet of the living, that none of them will blame you for your deeds. They will acquit you splendidly and, if possible, give you a prize for your chivalry, for your punishment of criminals and usurers, and for all the beneficent aid which your blessed hands have provided to the poor and needy." "Now Fred," replied the Lord in a jesting tone, as they approached the house, "I'd rather not let it come down to the favorable verdict of a jury, so long as I can avoid it. Precisely for this reason we have temporarily stuck ourselves in this pseudo-American skin. I have the honor of introducing myself to you as the great billionaire of the United States, Mr. Shaw, and this is my cousin, the promising Mr. Robert Bentley Shaw. Remember the names well. You know nothing, and your master, as far as he has told you, has embarked on a journey around the world. You don't know, of course, in which direction or along which road. That goes without saying, sir. I laughed tears when the gentleman of Scotland Yard so politely helped Miss Walton and me load the trunk. For I knew that it had been empty, and I understood what was hidden in it." "Shh, Fred, shut up. I know I can trust you, but you have one flaw." "Oh, sir, how could I?" "Yes, Fred, you have one mistake, and you had it in my youth. Even then you boasted too much of your boy master's mischievous pranks, and because of that you gave me many rebukes. I hope, meanwhile, that you have broken that habit and will not fall into that amiable mistake again." Fred had to give in with comic despair. He promised, however, that he would completely change in that regard, however hard it might cost him. He now endeavored to fulfill his duties as valet, and soon an excellent lunch was ready for the gentlemen, and it was plain to see from Fred as he filled the wine glasses how good it pleased him to be able to serve his lord again. After Lord Lister had lit a cigarette, he leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm a little curious now, Fred. Why did you even come here? For I understand that it is not without reason that you have defied the suspicions of Scotland Yard. Besides, you have my orders to visit me only on important matters." The servant ran a hand through his hair. "Donkey, who I am. Out of great joy to see you again, I would forget everything. Yes, it was not easy to get here unnoticed. But I first crossed London in all directions by tram, until at last I outwitted that cursed detective called Flea. Well, it worked. I changed my clothes at the Euston station, and there I saw the detective lurking around. But he looked around for a valet and not a common gentleman, for as such I passed him by and took a tram to the West End. Then the sniffer dog had lost my trail. And here is the letter." At these words Fred produced a letter which he handed to his master. "Why do you think this letter is of such great weight? I am very satisfied with you and your size caution, but your arrival was not harmless. In spite of your goodwill you could have sent us the whole party of Scotland Yard on our roof. Excuse me, sir, but doesn't the stamp read Caneroon? If only it were a message from his lordship, your uncle. Who knows what's at stake for you? And if the old miser and usurer, you forgive me for daring to call your uncle that, has exchanged the temporal for the eternal, God forgive me, but that would be the happiest day of my life. Should not your lordship then receive the inheritance so shamefully withheld from you? Well, I must admit that you had the right to regard the matter as serious. But it cannot be trusted. He is the best force in all of Scotland Yard, including Captain Baxter. You can be as sure as 2 and 2 is 4 that I have escaped him, assured Fred with conviction. Let us hope so, replied Lister, opening the letter. No sooner had he read through the few lines than he jumped up. His eyes sparkled and the veins on his forehead swelled. Charlie looked startled at his friend and master. He had never seen him like that. He felt that it would not be advisable at this moment to contradict Lord Lister. This one, however, slapped the letter with his flat hand with contempt. I recognize my uncle in that. But this shameful deed will not be tolerated, as truly as I am the true and true heir to the castle of Caneroon, as truly as my noble father has been the victim of wiles and ambushes and vile roguery. So really from your uncle, sir, muttered the old servant. No, this letter is not from my uncle himself, but he informs me of a new villainy of this degenerate descendant of our family. It is a cry for help from our old leaseholder, who also turns to me on behalf of several fellow sufferers. From year to year the old usurer has increased the rent until it can no longer be afforded. With a heavy heart the tenants have obeyed not to have to leave the land which had been cultivated by their families for hundreds of years. They have hoped for better times, but bad weather and bad harvests have disappointed them. They can no longer afford the rent. This loan shark, however, who is much worse than the Jew Shylock, remains unsettled. If they do not pay by the appointed date, they will be expelled according to law and law. As beggars, they must leave with wives and children the land where their ancestors for hundreds of years were in esteem and honor as industrious, sound farmers, and who never paid their long leases to the Listers a day late. It is a rogue's thanks for 100 years of faithful service, that men are driven from their house and court. But I don't want it to happen, for I too am a Lister, and I am the real lord, not he who dwells in the castle. Old Fred had folded his hands and a thick tear rolled down his wrinkled cheeks into his grey beard. A real Lister, that's my lord. Oh, I know, thou shalt not suffer the faithful, industrious MacCarthy and the others to perish. You will prosper, Lord Edward, for whatever you undertake, God's blessing rests on it. Yes, I will prevent this roguery. MacCarthy will not have enlisted my help in vain. Here's your money, Fred. It's all right if you don't show up at the villa too soon, dude. The lord took a pack of banknotes from his wallet and handed it to Fred, who looked at him intently. You depart, continued the lord, at once from here to Holyhead, and on by steamer to Dublin. Rent there or better buy 2 good horses with carriage and wait for me in your well-known 3 Roads Tun in the southern suburb. There is also a key to the small garden gate, which I use as Raffles. The gate is difficult to distinguish from the outside. You can take advantage of this, because I don't trust the detective. And now, get ready at once. Fred was full of fire. He had not seen his Irish homeland in a long time, and especially the awareness of being present when his adored young lord rescued the hapless tenant farmers from the clutches of his miserly uncle, made his heart swell with pride. Hastily he took his leave and raced along a path indicated to him by Lord Lister through bushes and undergrowth to an almost invisible wooden door in the fence. The gate was well oiled and could therefore be opened and closed inaudibly. The valet came out close to another villa in another street and unnoticed reached an omnibus waiting there, which took him close to the Norder station. Meanwhile Lord Lister had lit a fresh cigarette and read MacCarthy's letter again. Suddenly he looked up. "Did you can hear nothing out in the garden?" he asked, listening sharply, but with the greatest composure. Chapter 3. The Flea on the Warfield. Good Fred was only a mediocre artist of disguise, and besides, not nearly quick enough to compete, as he thought, with Detective Mahone. Lord Lister had not immediately trusted the business when he learned that the crafty Mahone, nicknamed the Flea, was on the battlefield. However, he was wary. "It seems to me, Cousin Robert," he said, that I hear someone sneaking about on the creaking gravel in front of the house. I should be surprised if it wasn't the famous flea. Let's see, Robert, do you look American enough to appear before a detective? Oh yes, that will work. He took another inquiring look in the mirror himself, and found with pleasure that no one in the already somewhat greying middle-aged gentleman, with his full beard fastened to his face by an ingeniously invented means, could see the elegant young Lord Lister. Once again he turned to Charlie Brand. Nephew, don't forget that we've been here for a month to study aviation, as it's marked on our passport. What? Exclaimed Charlie with admiration, do we have a pass too? Naturally, replied the Lord. I'll be careful not to impersonate something I can't prove. Moreover, I have imitated the two Americans as faithfully as possible. Even the consul, who knows them anyway, has not noticed the deception. But do you really think, Edward? I beg you to think of our family relationship. My name is Uncle Shaw. Dear uncle, do you really think Mahome is out there? Naturally. Fred's disguises aren't worth a cent. But come now to dine. And let's light up a real Havana, that's more American. Here, dear cousin. I'll put some with me. And now, come on. The two gentlemen left the room, which Lord Lister carefully closed, and had gone out through the vestibule when two figures appeared from the right and left with lightning speed, calling them a loud stop. What do you want? Cried Lord Lister in such a genuine Yankee accent that Charlie had to bite his lips. It is a peculiar custom in England to harass the people. If you want to beg, here. The old American reached into his waistcoat pocket and held out a shilling to Captain Baxter with great magnificence. By the way, I don't allow people to hang out in my park. Next time you must wait outside at the garden gate when you come begging. Now, take it and get out of here. Captain Baxter was so taken aback that he stood open-mouthed for a few moments. It was close to taking the shilling. But Mahome too, because that was the other one, looked surprised. Would he have been mistaken after all? But when he telephoned to Scotland Yard, the haunted valet was still pacing in front of the house. Captain Baxter had mastered his astonishment. We are officers of Scotland Yard and do not come to beg. Very striking indeed, exclaimed Lister in a Yankee tone. Drums, Robert, what do you say? From the great Scotland Yard, the most famous police station in the world. And are you really detectives from Scotland Yard? Captain Baxter punched his colleague in the ribs. What are you doing, Mahome? These are not the good ones. After all, these are Americans. You've been doing all kinds of stupid tricks lately. The flea didn't answer much. But the servant walked up and down here for a long time. However, I did not see him enter or come out again. The two detectives looked at each other indecisively. It is illegal in England to enter anyone's property without permission or without lawful reason, and Americans are, of course, aware of such regulations. It was our pleasure, gentlemen, to get to know two of the members of Scotland Yard, whose fame has also spread to America. But we are just planning to have dinner. Captain Baxter took heart. He took off his hat, for both were in civilian, and said, "May I introduce myself, Captain Baxter of Scotland Yard?" What? The famous Captain Baxter, of whom I have read so much? No, but that's lucky, my dear Captain. I would not have dared to dream that. Our whole club will open mouth and ears when I tell you that. Lord Lister at these words incessantly shook hands with Captain Baxter, who with humble pride accepted this overseas tribute. And you may have heard of me, too, Mr. William P. Sure, in America every kid knows me, from Chicago. For the fool, whispered Mahome to the captain, that is the greatest billionaire, the oil king. We almost made a bad mistake there. Hands at home. That the great American industrialist and stockbroker introduced himself to him greatly flattered Baxter. He nodded with a smile. My colleague, Mr. Mahome, made a mistake. I don't know yet, Captain, ventured Mahome. I thought I recognized him and saw him here in front of the house. Shut up, Mahome, when your chief explains a matter to these American gentlemen. It was, of course, a mistake on the part of Detective Mahome, when he supposed, a servant of the great unknown, Raffles, aka Lord Lister. It's the other way around, Captain, interrupted the other detective. You are insufferable with your eternal wisdom, to see you enter here. Or do you perhaps know something of his presence, sirs? Lord Lister stood amiably smoking his cigar, hands in his trouser pockets. "Surely we won't be interrogated, Robert?" "Oh uncle, how can you think such a thing? Mr. Baxter is a gentleman from head to toe. He would not do such a thing to you." The captain felt very flattered and raised his hand with a gesture of repulsion. "But my dear gentleman, how could I? I'm just asking casually. It would be of the utmost importance to us to find a trace. That cursed Raffles has been setting all Scotland Yard in motion for a year now and is undetectable." "Ah, Mr. Baxter, that must be a trifle to a man like you. And you too, dear Sir Detective, what was your name again? Impress me to be particularly suited to your profession. Coincidence, gentlemen, mere coincidence, that he has escaped you thus far. I have laughed heartily at some of his tricks, but I do not consider him to be as genius as the newspaper reporters regard him. Now that I have got to know you personally, I shall follow your work with even greater interest than hitherto, and I shall be exceedingly pleased if you finally succeed in catching him. And now you certainly want to light a cigar. You don't get them much like this. They are from my own plantations in Cuba." At these words, Lord Lister took a handful from his breast pocket and offered them. "Take them, Captain Baxter. I have even more. And now, gentlemen, farewell and good luck." The two detectives exhaust themselves in thanks. Captain Baxter warmly shook hands with the billionaire, and so they parted amicably, without the detectives even thinking of asking the American gentleman's steps. As we know, however, Lord Lister was even prepared for this possibility. Chapter 4. A desperate tenant. Calm and friendly, McCarthy's tenement lay in the midst of golden cornfields, surrounded by bushy hills. Worried and frowning, the tenant, a tall, well-built man with tanned face and luxuriant blonde hair, a man of about 40, stood on the doorstep of his house. He watched a chariot in which a merry party of gentlemen rode toward the castle, which was visible some distance away. Beside him stood his wife, her eyes weeping red. A boy about 5 years old held onto her apron, holding a child barely a year old in her arms. A girl and a boy of 7 and 9 years old played with the carelessness of youth in the garden. The carriage in which rode the party, which had been having a picnic near here, belonged to the owner of the castle, Lord Edward's uncle, Lord Reynald Lister, whose character we have already come to know. He had stopped at the farm and had the tenant called out. In the presence of his guests he had reminded him without compassion that the last payment term had expired. If the next day he had not paid the rent to the last cent, the lord would have him and his family evicted from the house, as it belonged to one who was unable to pay the meagre sum which he owed to his lord was on time to meet. "Oh, have a little more patience, my lord," the tenant had prayed. "You know, Lord Reynald, that I was always punctual, like my father and forefathers who tilled these fields. But the rent is too high, and the crop failure." "Poppy porridge!" exclaimed the lord scornfully. "I know, the crop failure and the bad weather are to blame. I don't want to hear any more of that. You cannot house, and I need a tenant who can. If you don't pay tomorrow, you can go to the devil with your whole family. Understood?" The tenant straightened and looked at the lord with a steady gaze. "I'll pay you all, but you must grant me respite, for, do you know, Lord Reynald Lister, that I am a leaseholder here, and that I too wish to exercise my right in the United Kingdom? I can't be chased away at once, as you think you do, especially when the crop has failed through no fault of my own." "What? You wretched peasant, have the sad courage to so brutalize me? That is the result of my brother's actions, and I understand whose help you rely on. But I don't care about all your lamentations and protests. I want to see money. Tomorrow you will count the amount due to me, otherwise I will have you chased by the police from this farm that belongs to me, even if you beg for mercy on your bare knees. Remember that. And Lord Edward Lister, that starving man, is poor as a church rat and can't help you. My word is law here, and what I say, it happens." With tears in her eyes now, Mary, the tenant's wife, knelt by the carriage. "Oh, Lord Reynald, have pity, for the sake of the children." But the tenant raised her up with his strong hand and bade her go into the house. When she looked at her husband, she realized that she must obey, and with her child in her arms she staggered home, sobbing. "Do not humble yourself in vain," said her husband sharply. "That man has a heart of stone. Dog, do you dare insult me?" I don't answer curses. Is this all your lordship has to say to me? Goddamn! Run to the devil, you impudent peasant. Then I need not go far, answered the peasant calmly, turning to go home. Now the tenant was alone again with his wife and children, his heart filled with care and sorrow. They watched the carriage with the noisy company. Tenant McCarthy and his still weeping wife feared the future. They thought less of themselves than of the hard fate that awaited their children. The tenant waved a hand, as if to say, "How does it help? The battle must be fought." Suddenly he looked up in surprise. From the opposite side to that in which the chariot had disappeared, he saw two horsemen approaching. It was plain to see that they were coming to his farm. They approached with furious speed and it seemed as if the horses had wings. McCarthy clasped his hands together and looked with great tension. "Mary. Look. They're coming to our house." "If that won't be the police already, will it?" cried the landlord's wife, clutching her youngest child more tightly to her breast. "Stupid woman, don't speak of the police." "No, I was thinking of someone else. And if I see that leading rider, well, that's none other than—" "Who do you mean?" "I have lost all courage. Oh, Mac, what will become of our children? What should we do ourselves? Do you think we're going to have to part and—" "Now shut up, you." "Yes, it is he, it is he. Oh, I knew he wouldn't abandon old McCarthy." "But who do you mean, Mac? Say it anyway, speak it anyway. I am dying of fear and nervousness. Who is it?" "You are struck blind, Mary. Otherwise you would recognize that tall, slender man who is a long way ahead of the other. Open your eyes wide. Don't you recognize him yet? Now everything is going to be all right. Yes, I see it. It is our young lord. But what does he come to do? Does he know anything about our misfortune?" asked Mary. During this conversation the two horsemen had approached, and at last Lord Lister sprang from his panting, steaming steed, throwing the reins to the tenant. "Fred," he said, "your old legs have held up bravely, I must say. You haven't forgotten how to ride a horse yet." Then he turned to the tenant, shook his hand, and then extended his slender judge to Mary, who wished to kiss her, but the proud Englishman prevented it. "Now, McCarthy, here we are, tidying up our heritage. Now both of you have complete peace of mind. Not much will come of the resolutions of my dear uncle. I'll still be able to force him. You are leaseholders here, and your ancestors fought many battles here with and under mine. It would be a fine thing if the family of the McCarthys could be driven abroad and into misery for a wretched little bit of money. I'll see to it that the rent is lowered. She won't weigh you down from now on. You must be able to do your work cheerfully as a leaseholder, and, like your forefathers, cultivate the old ground here as free, proud men." "Oh, Lord Lister," said the tenant, with moist eyes, "if you could work that out, then I would bless you and my children and children's children after me. What we owe by law and equity, we will gladly pay. The rent, however, which your uncle has imposed on us, is much too high, and makes us, tenant farmers, all beggars. This will be arranged, McCarthy, I give you my word on it. I will speak to my dear uncle. But first tell me how high the amount owed by you is." The tenant was silent for a moment. "He saved us all and now I have to muster £450, he replied softly. "But have you been able to accept that, you and the other tenants? You shouldn't have put up with that. That is ridiculous, such a high amount for your small farm. Excuse me, McCarthy, but that was a great folly. You should have resisted it with all your might. Nor did he have the right to impose such heavy burdens on you, for everything is officially recorded in the archives of the Castle of Caneroon. Now, I'll fix things up for you again. You drive forward again, Fred. I can't give you rest yet. See if the old servants are still in the castle. Whisper a single word of mine in the ear of the old faithful, see if I can get into the archive unnoticed, and leave the door open for me. I would like to appear unexpectedly. You can take your horse, as I will, into the old stable to the left of the park, for we may need the animals if we are to leave Caneroon in one piece." Fred nodded with satisfaction and self-consciousness. He was proud to be able to help his master, and this task seemed child's play to him. He was already back on his brown stallion and rode away. The Lord took his wallet and handed McCarthy £105 notes. "Get yourself a proper receipt. Or maybe it's even better if Mary delivers it. Harness your little chariot, Mac, take her to the castle and wait outside for her to come back with the receipt. But bear no impudence, Mary. Don't be embarrassed before the old miser. Invoke the ground lease papers, which are in the archive, and demand in a determined tone that the lease be reduced again. You will not be deprived of your right." "Oh, sir, how can I ever thank you enough? Yes, things look different now. I also believe that Mary can handle the case better than I can. She's got her mouth in the right place. Perhaps I too would be beside myself with rage to face the old usurer, and to think how much suffering he has caused us. And I am sure he has vilely stolen your inheritance from you." Lord Lister smiled at the deluge of the good tenant, who was otherwise little talkative. "So get out and about. The matter is urgent. Take the money, Mary, get dressed, and then hasten to the castle, where you must do as I have told you." At these words he took up the reins which McCarthy had tied about a tree, sprang into the saddle, and, with a friendly greeting, rode at a brisk trot to the old castle of his fathers. Soon he had reached the old white wall which encircled the huge park around the castle, and he turned to the stable where he could already see Fred's brownie. He took his horse there too, took a rather bulky pack from his saddle bag, and looked around to see if no one was around. After making sure he was not being watched, he took out a black silk mask and fixed it over his face. He pressed his soft sports hat deep over his forehead and nimbly crept into the park gate left open by Fred. Here he turned into an apparently disused path covered by undergrowth, creepers and weeds. It was extremely difficult to make our way here. But the young lord knew every spot here from his happy childhood, and was even glad to find that apparently no one had set foot here in a long time. Chapter 5. The Victoria's Tomb. At a bend in the path, two quirky Indian columns rose before him, but they were almost completely hidden by moss, ivy, and gigantic fern plants. Between these columns was a rusty iron door. Lord Lister looked around attentively, but the undergrowth and natural wilderness of this part of the park shielded him completely from prying eyes. He took out a beautiful steel chisel from his pocket and after little effort the rusted lock cracked. Lord Lister was prepared for anything. He now took a squirt of oil from one of his pockets and smeared with it the old lock as well as the handles. The door now opened silently and deep darkness gaped at him. The Lord closed the door behind him again and lit a candle. Then he calmly descended the stairs in front of him. About 20 steps led him into a fantastic Indian hall, in which on either side stood an Indian coffin in dark red stone niches. In the center of the room was a couch, behind which was placed a smiling, well-behaved Buddha statue on a marble column. In the family chronicle of the Listers a history was attached to this tomb, which was confirmed by the inscriptions on the coffins. A Lord Lister, who had been to India on business for the East India Company and held the rank of vice-king there, was married to an immensely wealthy Indian princess, whom he, after resigning from his post, had taken to his castle in England. When he died shortly afterwards from climate change, his wife was inconsolable. In order to remain always united with her husband, she had the subterranean burial vault built in the park. A secret passage led from her chambers in the castle to the tomb vault, so that if she wished to visit her husband's tomb, she would not have to make her way through the park. This tomb was generally called in the castle and in its immediate vicinity the mausoleum of the viceroy. Lord Lister laid his package on the golden couch and opened it. "My brave forefather, I don't think, will blame me, any more than the princess, for changing my clothes here." He lit a new candle, took a folding mirror from the pack, and began marking his face with all kinds of markers like the most accomplished actor. Soon it had acquired a brownish hue and, at the same time, by the application of special shadows and dark rims of the eyes, a feminine expression. He also took a beautifully embroidered silk robe in bright colors from the package he had brought with him. After taking off his skirt, he donned the silk robe. He fastened a broad gold bracelet on one of his wrists, and slipped on his fingers rings of glittering stones. Then he took a wig of jet black curls, fastened it on his head, and decorated the black hair with a silk band. After taking off his boots, turning up his trouser legs, and donning yellow silk shoes, the regal figure of the Indian princess, probably somewhat taller than she really had been, stood in her own sepulchre. With an inquisitive glance in the folding mirror she examined her own image and, it must be said, the disguise was very successful. It did not suit the silk dress, however, that the Indian queen now took 2 shiny revolvers from the pack, which she hid in the pockets of the robes on either side. Then she packed the man's skirt and boots into the empty paper, rolled everything up as small as possible, and hid the package behind her own coffin, in the darkest corner of the alcove. She walked to and fro for a few moments, sat down on the couch, deep in thought, and at last muttered, "Now I must smoke a cigarette first." While Raffles, in the disguise of the Indian princess, was smoking his cigarette, he looked up suddenly. He had heard a sound. Now he heard it again. Though it was still a long way off, he could clearly hear steps. The sound was clearly audible in the vault. Lord Lister had taken his cigarette from his mouth, kicked it out lest it smoulder, and threw it behind the viceroy's grave. He blew out the candle, pressed the wick between his fingers, and listened. The steps drew nearer, and he discerned a sigh as if one were breathing heavily. "Someone is coming down the subterranean passage of the castle here," whispered the lord. "I'm not curious otherwise, but who would come here now, and what heavy burden would he bear to sigh like that? I need to know more about that." Lord Lister hastened to take shelter, and found it behind the princess's coffin, where there was still plenty of room in the alcove. In the guise of the princess, moreover, he could not choose a more suitable hiding place, especially if he should ever feel the desire to have a word with the visitor. The rising of the Indian princess from her grave would also frighten the bravest. As the mausoleum was quite high, he only had to get on his knees so as not to be seen, while the marble frame provided excellent support for his arms. In anticipation he looked into the darkness around the corner of the mausoleum, from where, with sufficient light, he could see the opening of the corridor behind the Buddha statue. Loud and heavy the steps approached. Suddenly a faint ray of light appeared in the opening of the corridor, and the lord kept his gaze fixed on the same spot. His patience would be rewarded. The beam of light grew brighter and suddenly an elderly man came into the tomb, panting. He apparently carried a heavy grey box on his shoulder, while illuminating himself by means of an electric flashlight. He placed his lantern on a protruding point of the Buddha statue, carefully lifted the grey coffin from his shoulder and set it down in front of the column. "Devilish," he grumbled in a disgruntled tone, "the bad air in that cursed corridor and the heavy box, it's almost too much for me." He staggered to the couch and sighed. When, however, he took back a high-turned collar and put the floppy hat that had partly hidden his face to his side to wipe the sweat from his brow, the fair princess, who lay on her knees in the alcove, and closed her eyes dared to believe, almost forgot himself, and uttered a cry of surprise. But with his usual self-control, Lord Lister suppressed his astonishment and thought, "Look, Uncle Reynald. Now I'm curious what he's got to do here, what he's going to do with that box, and whether he wants to hide the thing or its contents here." Lord Reynald had recovered a little from his fatigue. He got up and went to his coffin. "A strange air in such a tomb," he said, shaking his head. "If one didn't know better, one would think it smelled of cigarettes and wax candles. Now get to work. No one will look for the papers here. Here they are best kept, for I bet no one but me knows the secret of Buddha, which I discovered by chance in my youth." Lord Edward did not lose a syllable of his uncle's words, nor did he turn an eye from him. But how astonished he was when the old lord pressed the gem he had so often admired on the chest of the Buddha statue. But he had never thought that the diamond held the key to a secret which was now being revealed to him. For as soon as the old lord had pressed the stone, the front part of the statue fell down to the column. Lord Lister now saw that the wooden Buddha was hollow and had long served as a secret hiding place, for several locked compartments became visible. The old lord opened one of the compartments with a key, and then unlocked the chest that stood at the bottom. From this he took a pack of papers or documents, slid them into the open compartment of the Buddha statue and closed it again. He then took several smaller wallets from the chest he had brought and divided them into the other compartments, all of which he carefully closed. Finally he lifted the front part of the statue and let it fall back into its usual place. As before, the Indian idol smiled, and even the keenest eye had discovered no treacherous gap in this carved sculpture. "Look, now my dear cousin can come and sue me for the sake of those tenants. I will swear that there are no papers, and as proof I will put my entire archive at the disposal of the jury. At least it will be officially dusted. And he may also come for the jewels of the Indian princess and for his inheritance. He can't prove anything to me. And I know nothing about the withdrawal of the disinheritance of the Mad Admiral, his father. Why do I keep all that junk anyway? I should have burned everything a long time ago. But I don't know what always held me back. Anyway, everything is well put away. He may come and call me to account. My lawyer will prove to him the nullity of his claims, and his audacity to act as heir and take my rights will be unlawyered. The loving uncle laughed maliciously and put his felt hat back on. He closed the grey box again, put it on his shoulder, took up the light again and left the subterranean abode without looking around. Soon he had disappeared into the hallway, hidden from Lord Edward's eyes. The Indian princess now emerged cautiously from her hiding place. She rushed to the opening of the corridor and listened. The steps were almost inaudible, and after a few moments all was dead still. Edward Lister lit his candle, walked hastily to the Buddha statue, and paused in thought before the idol for a while. He walked restlessly between the statue and the couch. At last he sat down on the golden Indian couch and leaned his left arm on one of the gold-stitched silk cushions. Deep sorrow for his lost life overcame him, and this old scoundrel, whom he had just heard, was the cause of it all. Burning hatred flared up in him, hatred against this uncle, against society that only respects and reveres the rich and rejects the poor and puts in their way all kinds of obstacles that prevent them from working their way up again. And now that he was done with his former life, now that he could no longer go back, now he had to learn by sheer chance that he could have been happy after all. Now he understood that this villain, who had already deceived and made his father unhappy, who had also ruined himself, into an abyss from which he could no longer be rescued, now he understood that he could have saved his uncle unmasking and fighting, if only he had had the necessary patience to wait for the right moment. And his thoughts also drifted to the lovely young girl whom he had met too late in his life. Why hadn't this happened a year earlier, as had this revelation in the tomb of the Indian princess, at the mausoleum of the Vice-King? Then he might have been happy with the good, dear Miss Walton. Lord Lister sighed deeply. Then, however, he rose and shook his black locks. Woe unto you, false, wicked uncle, you who have brought misfortune to my father and me. In a different way than you suspect, I will deal with you. I will meet you where you are most sensitive to touch, in your filthy passion of greed and avarice, which has made you a criminal. I no longer feel sorry for you, in awe of our family name. Above all, I want to settle with you now. You yourself provide me with the proofs. That which thou fearest most, which thou cannot bear, that I will make of thee, a beggar. You will feel miserable and desperate in your poverty, and the love of men will not comfort you as it comforts me. The poorest day laborer will cast you from his threshold, for your subordinates are filled with hatred towards you. Great determination now appeared on the princess's face, and her eyes sparkled as if they really reflected the hatred of a passionate Eastern woman. Lord Lister had overcome his misery and took life as it was. Calmly he replaced the burned-out candle with a new one, then he pressed the gem, which communicated with the lock of the secret mechanism. Carefully he let the front part of the Buddha statue slide down and the locked compartments lay in front of him. His steel key of his own invention fitted the uncomplicated locks. The first compartment he opened contained the documents that old Lord Lister had put away here. He examined them by the light of the wax candle. On top lay the charter of MacCarthy's leasehold, an old parchment, which Patrick MacCarthy, one of the warriors under the then Lord Lister, for gallantry on the river Boyne, appointed as long-term leaseholder, and which bore the signature of the Lord Protector Cromwell. Apart from this copy, which had been entrusted to the Lord, probably no second existed, as duplicates were very seldom issued in those times. And yet the villain intended to drive the good MacCarthy and his family from the tenement farm, though he knew he had no right to do so. And why? Due to delay in payment of the rent? What did that small sum mean to the wealthy landowner? No, because he had learned that MacCarthy was in favor of Lord Edward and that he had turned to the young lord for help. The anger at this and the intention to rob his nephew of all possible support, however weak, had caused the loving uncle to take such an inhumane course towards his leaseholder. In the same compartment were also the charters of the 10 other tenants of the Caneroon farms, though not all of them were of Cromwell's time, like MacCarthy's. Lord Edward laid all these documents on the oriental couch. He then opened the other compartments and the various wallets. Emeralds, rubies, topazes and diamonds sparkled in beautiful Indian gold works. He immediately recognized the princess's family jewels. He remembered his childhood, when his mother, who had died young while his father tarried on distant seas, had let him admire the rare beautiful Indian ornaments. When the old lord had died, her false, dishonest brother-in-law had claimed that the whole treasure had vanished without a trace. The admiral, his brother, is said to have secretly appropriated them and cashed them in to pay gambling debts. And the dead man could not defend himself. Lord Reynald was believed, as his other lies had been believed. For the old lord, Edward's grandfather, too, the thought that his eldest son might have violated the family jewels was a chief cause of disinheriting the admiral. Lord Edward stared at the stones with burning eyes. He then closed the cases in which they were hidden and put everything down with the documents. But did not the villain speak of a will? Of the revocation of my father's disinheritance? Sure, he said that, and also that the real will was still there. In comparison, what do the jewels and these papers mean? My father restored to his honor, and I the rightful heir, not only to the name, but also to the family estates of the listers. I must have it. If Raffles ever showed himself to be a master thief, he will now prove that no shelter can be hidden from him. With trembling hands he searched once more the interior of the idol. In vain, however, everything was empty. The will was nowhere to be found. I thought he kept that here too. But I could be wrong. Perhaps he hid it elsewhere in the castle, along with his valuable papers. These jewels of my mother could become dangerous to him, should there ever be an inquest. The will, however, was easy to hide in a small place where no one would look for it. But I will find it, I must find it. My father must be restored to his honor, and the shameful impostor will not escape his just punishment. Carefully the Indian princess carried the various cases behind the tomb, making one package with the skirt and boots. Lord Lister hid the various documents in the wide breast pocket of the Indian robes. Then he lit a new candle, by whose light the Indian princess, with a revolver in her right hand, took silent steps down the subterranean passage toward the castle. Chapter 6. A great tenant's wife and a helpful ghost. Night had fallen. A portion of the picnic party, who knew the old miser, and how much he disliked having guests, had already taken leave of the old lord at the park. Only 3 gentlemen had complied with his invitation and sat down at a large oak table in the hall, where they made themselves comfortable with a glass of porter or ale. The lord had ordered a ham, as well as bread and butter, and the 3 guests, who were of dubious nobility and took great honor to be friends with Lord Lister, let themselves enjoy the evening bread as best they could. It did not hinder them that the old lord feigned urgent business and withdrew with a request to feast on his ale. He would finish his business as quickly as possible, and be back with them in a little while. It seemed, however, that he was held up longer than he had initially suspected, for it was not until after more than an hour that he reappeared and fell exhausted into an armchair. Dublin banker Morton politely poured him a glass of porter, a favourite drink of the English. Lord Reynald took a long gulp and sighed in relief. We know what matters he had done in the meantime. Now he felt safe from all possible attacks, and a scornful grin disfigured his face. Without mercy the unwilling tenants were at the mercy of him, and the first thing would be tomorrow that impudent McCarthy, who had bluffed his right, to be evicted from his house. Lord Reynald laughed out loud and emptied his glass in delight. A series of empty porter and ale bottles proved that the 3 other gentlemen had also tasted horribly in the absence of their host. They got into a good mood and became more talkative than ever. You bastards, exclaimed one of the guests, Sir Garnet, when a manservant had lit the old-fashioned lamps. What kind of a peculiar Indian woman is this, whose life-size portrait hangs there? The brown face, those big eyes, and that wonderful silk dress, you don't see something like that every day. His left neighbor touched him briefly and said, You can see that you haven't lived in this neighborhood long. That's the famous Indian princess. Our host has Eastern blood in his veins. It is one of the most beautiful legends of this region, that of the loving Indian, who, because the burning of a widow is not lawful in the United Kingdoms, had the famous mausoleum built in the park, there with all her treasures and jewels laid down beside her dead husband's splendor, sprinkled perfumed waters and frankincense about herself, and died there, to be united in life and death with her lord and master. Nonsense, grumbled the old lord. Do not believe such stories. And it must not have been many jewels and valuables either. Our family treasure is meager and not a single Indian jewel is to be found. Well, Lister, the banker laughed mysteriously, of course they have disappeared. For it is well known that your brother, the Mad Admiral, has sold them all to pay his gambling debts. My dear, the world always knows more about such intimate family matters than it does itself. I know nothing about Indian jewels, and it would certainly be more pleasant to me if I could show off their possessions. A beautiful woman, cried the fat Sir Garnet. There's race in that. Such a thing is not seen with our pale blue blonde and bloodless Anglo-Saxon type. Look at such an old lover. Take care, Sir Garnet, lest your wife hear you. She may, assured the landlord. She will not be so jealous of a dead portrait as of a living chambermaid. But she herself would have to admit that Indian princess is unparalleled in beauty. And when I think how faithful she has been to her husband, the noble Lord Lister, I can't help but empty my glass in sincere admiration for this wonderful woman from the far land. Sir Garnet lifted his glass and the others followed with a loud hip, hip, hooray. His example. But Sir Garnet did not drink. He set his glass down so quickly and hard that the contents flew over the rim, and at the same time he sprang to his feet with a wave of dismissive hand in horror. What is it? Why don't you drink? The others exclaimed in astonishment. You may or may not believe me, but when I finished my foolish speech, the princess's eyes sparkled and rolled. Ha ha! Laughed the lord. The good Garnet has been a little too strong on my porter and ale, which he has been so generous to offer. I didn't think that after a few innocent glasses you would get hallucinations. Nonsense. Sir Garnet defended himself. I'm not really drunk on those few glasses. But I am sure that Oriental one turned her eyes. I don't feel comfortable. You know, Sir Garnet, what the legend tells. Even when she had already died, her love could not yet find rest. Her figure was often seen at night in the park and forest in the places where she would have liked to dwell with Lord Lister. Also it is said that a dull sigh and lament is heard several times from the tomb, and one night one of the servants, who was about to close the windows during a thunderstorm, saw her with wrathful countenance sitting here in the chair where our friend Buxley now has seated. The skinny gentleman with the sideburns looked around shivering and involuntarily pushed back his chair. The lord shrugged and laughed. Soon you will tell that the unfortunate princess still haunts my castle. Good heavens, I should know that best. She has not yet appeared to me as a ghost. It would be bad for her too. Whether you, thought the banker. At this moment one of the servants appeared and approached the lord and whispered something to him. Let the woman come here. But all her whining won't help her. I've had enough of that case. I want to show those recalcitrant peasants who's boss here. Have the police been notified? He asked the old servant. To serve your lordship. They will appear at the castle in the morning. Beautiful. Then tomorrow we will put an end to this vexatious affair and McCarthy can go his own way. Do the lords allow me to let the tenant's wife come in? Oh, most certainly, replied the banker. It will be very interesting if you tell that bitch the truth, and her jeremiads will not be without theatrical charm. Hi, James, fill our glasses and let the female in. The lord took a good gulp to receive the tenant's wife properly and to explain the matter to her. Good Mary McCarthy had put on her Sunday clothes, and with her red bodice and dark hair, in spite of her many freckles, looked very charming. The look of care and sorrow had vanished from her face since that afternoon. Now that she had more than the money she needed, Mary had regained all her self-confidence and habitual boldness. Fearlessly she entered the hall, and approached the company with the greatest composure. Good evening, my lord, she said in a cool tone, greeting the others with a nod of her head. You certainly understand why I come. You have said this afternoon that the last installment by which we must pay is tomorrow afternoon. If we fail to pay, we would be evicted from home and caught by the police. All right, replied the lord, lighting a cigar. And that's all, Miss McCarthy, and you could have saved yourself the trouble of coming here. Your pleading and complaining is in vain. I won't mind it. You are very mistaken, my lord. I have not come here to beg and complain. The lord looked at her in astonishment. Have you come here perhaps to say insolent things? Then get out at once. Mary shrugged with an indifferent gesture. I do not understand you. I don't know why I should beg and complain, for, According to your wishes, I will bring the money today, that is, before the time you set has expired." The lord had turned deathly white and was staring at her with wide eyes. "What?" he exclaimed. "Bring money? The lease? The whole rent?" "It's not the actual rent. It is much smaller, as you well know. But for this time my husband also pays you the increased amount that you extort from us poor people. I tell you, however, this is the last time, and then we will pay the old lease again, which can only be increased by royal decree, not by you. For, this I tell you, the McCarthys have been leaseholders of the Lister family since the days of Cromwell, and we can prove it." The three guests looked at the lord not without glee, and waited in intense attention for his reply. A look of predatory ferocity appeared on the host's face. "Those are vicious lies. But, if you have the money with you, pay it here." He pushed aside plates, glasses, and bottles. "I take these gentlemen to witness that I am paying here the rent of £450 demanded by Lord Lister in 90 notes, and at the same time protesting the amount of the rent. I demand that the rent be reduced again, as it is written and stamped." "Very well," said the lord excitedly. "First the money, so I can see if the bills are real. The rest will come." Mary took out the packet of banknotes, neatly wrapped, from her picket, opened it and counted out the notes on the table. The lord's eyes sparkled and his hands trembled as he took the money. "I beg you to sign this receipt, which I brought with me for convenience, or else I'll have to withdraw my notes. In that case I will not pay you until tomorrow in the presence of the police and other officers, and these gentlemen here will testify that it is your own fault if the lease is not already settled today." The lord foamed at his mouth with anger. "I will not return these notes to you, for I have every reason to doubt their authenticity." "What?" exclaimed Mary, taking a step closer with determination. "And thou art not ashamed, thou old sinner, to accuse a poor woman, who has laboriously borrowed the money, of presenting counterfeit money to thee? And you want to keep it without receipt? And you, gentlemen, sit there dumb and silent, and, like English gentlemen, let a poor woman taunt and insult in your presence?" "Yes, it is true, Lister," said the banker hesitantly. "You cannot possibly refuse the payment, and you are obliged to sign the receipt. Now, give here, I'll sign." The lord held the receipt at arm's length away. His face turned purplish red, and his eyes sparkled wickedly. With a mocking laugh he said, "Very well, and I will also sign that the increased rent will be returned to the old amount, on condition that you show me the document or a copy thereof proving your claims. But there is no charter concerning this lease, for the whole thing is a fantasy of yours." "What, Mr. Lord? A chimera? Have you not kept that valuable paper, which was once given to one of your forefathers after the Battle of the Bone River, safe in your archives?" "Whether my ancestors possessed such a piece, I do not know. I only know that, despite all possible effort, I have not been able to find such a piece in the archive." "Then you treat official documents lightly, and your archives must look disorderly, if a poor peasant family knows how to keep documents better than you. For I invoke you, sirs, as witnesses when I furnish proof that our claim concerning the lease is justified. For here I have the document, which is an heirloom in our family and which has always been preserved in the most careful manner." Mary unfolded the parchment and wanted to read the portion of it pertaining to the leasehold. But besides himself with rage and fury, the lord sprang up, and before she suspected he had taken the document from her to tear it up. However, the sturdy parchment resisted. The three guests looked at each other in shock. Suddenly, however, the fat country gentleman, Sir Garnet, gave a shriek and sprang from his chair, so that this massive piece of furniture fell over with great noise. "The princess!" he exclaimed in dismay. "The ghost of the princess!" A chill ran down everyone's spine, including Lord Lister, who had known the worst. For in the place of the portrait they perceived the real figure of the Indian queen. Full of wrath she threw back her black curls with a single movement of her ringed hand. Her big eyes sparkled and rolled wildly, and with a royal gesture she spoke in a grave voice. "Sign, Lord Lister." "That's too much. That's too much. It's haunted here at the castle. Get away from here," exclaimed Sir Garnet, rushing out bareheaded to fetch his horse from the stable and, as if chased by wolves, to rush home. The other two guests also did not feel comfortable. They looked in turn at the princess and the old lord, who stared at the receipt which the valiant tenant's wife had again presented to him. And with a hasty gesture she had repossessed the precious document. "The princess," murmured the lord, "do the dead really come back?" Thereupon, however, he tried to shake off the feeling of terror, which made itself felt all the more strongly now that he had only made a journey to the tomb. "To sign, Lord Lister," whispered the banker in terror. "The document is real, there is no doubt about it, as real as the notes, which I have examined carefully." "No, I'm not signing. Though angels and devils, spirits and gods would compel me. I do not want that, McCarthy." At this moment there was a double bang, and the Indian princess stood before them with two very modern revolvers in her hands, which she had pointed at the lord and his two guests. And the ghostly alto voice was heard again. "I'll give you 5 minutes to think. If you have not yet done your duty, have not signed the receipt, your life is over, as well as that of your comrades." A chill fell upon the gentlemen as they saw the mouths of the gleaming revolvers. Mary had a fountain pen with her, which she handed to the lord with a mocking smile. "That damned Indian bitch!" gritted the villain's teeth, his eyes fixed on the menacing revolvers. Lord Reynald was captivated as if by hypnotic power. He took the pen from the peasant woman's hand and, while uttering a curse, put his name under the receipt, with which also the promise to reduce the rent had been made. Already brave Mary, without long hesitation, had picked up the letter and made her way to the door, when again the voice of the princess was heard. "It is your luck, false lord with your ill-gotten title. However, this is only the beginning. The Eastern Queen will come back to ask you to account for all the fine titles and the millions that you have wrongfully obtained. She will take everything from you and give it, like the castle of Caneroon, to the real heir." The two guests stared at Lord Reynald in horror. But the landlord's wife, who had halted at the door, turned and, pointing with outstretched hand at the villain, she exclaimed, "Yes, it is true what the Indian princess says. The same has been whispered to each other on land for a long time." Then the old lord, face twisted with anger, sprang up, shouting in a louder voice, "Wretched deceit! Crossed card! My cousin Edward is behind that, or the devil may get me." He wanted to reach into his pocket to pull out the revolver he always carried with him. At that moment, however, a scornful laugh rang out, and a clap of thunder rang through the hall. A green vapor rose up before the figure of the princess, and at the same time the door of the hall slammed shut behind the landlord's wife. Mary had left the castle. Involuntarily, Lord Reynald and his guests had looked back. When they turned their eyes back to the princess, the fragrant green vapor had cleared, and only the oil painting of the Oriental woman looked down upon the astonished trio. If a wonderful, soft scent had not told them the contrary, the three gentlemen would have thought that all had been but a dream. Chapter 7. Preparatory measures. Two horsemen stood in front of McCarthy's farmstead. The tenant held the slender hand of the one in his great, calloused right and shook it vigorously over and over. "1,000 thanks, Lord Edward. I will never forget that you saved us from the clutches of that greedy loan shark and villain. If you ever need someone to walk through a fire for you, call McCarthy. I know, good friend. I would trust you as much as I do myself." And he continued thoughtfully, "Who knows, if an opportunity may not soon arise to prove your loyalty to me. But we won't hope so. Even if it should cost me my life, I will not forsake you," exclaimed the tenant with fire. His wife also came out, still in her Sunday clothes. "Lord Edward," she exclaimed, "here is also your fountain pen holder back with kind thanks. Lucky I knew what joker was hidden in the princess's robes, for I think I would have died of terror at the appearance of the ghost otherwise. But you played your part divinely beautifully. I would never have recognized you by your voice." "Hush, hush," warned the lord, "the bushes have ears too. Mouth shut. You have only heard that the castle is haunted." "Oh, Lord Edward, don't doubt us," replied the tenant's wife, with mild reproach. "No, I do not doubt you, dear friends." "McCarthy, get on your horse at once, understand? Here are the other charters. Ride to the 10 farms of Caneroon Castle, and hand over to each tenant his document, lest any of them overpay a penny and prove their dues, should the police come tomorrow. That is the best revenge you can take against the old loan shark." "I'll gladly sort that out at once," exclaimed McCarthy. The young lord handed him the papers, shook their hands once more, and rode their loaded horses at full trot to Dublin with Fred. When the officials arrived at Caneroon Castle the next day after their business was done, they brought some money with them, for almost all the tenants had been able to pay the old modest rent. None of them, however, could be driven from the farm, for all had presented their official proof, against which the authority was powerless. The magistrates even had vehement words with the old lord, for he claimed that it was impossible what he was told of those official documents. Lord Raynald walked lonely up and down the spacious hall, his fists clenched convulsively, almost mad with rage. "How does the whole pack suddenly come into possession of the documents?" he exclaimed. Suddenly he stopped motionless, mouth wide open. "Hell and devil!" he cried. "No one is there unlike my cousin Edward behind. God damn him! The phantom of the princess, by which I, old donkey, let me bluff, is his work. He knows all the secrets here. That cursed portrait there on the wall must have some mechanism I am not familiar with. But if he knows all the secrets, good heavens! Then he also knows, but no, that cannot be. That must not be. I must know. I want to see it right away. Great justice, my Indian jewels! Would I have committed all these crimes for nothing? Would I, who was always so proud of my shrewdness, have been fooled by that rascal? It can't be true, it would be too terrible, it would kill me. Then the prophecy of the princess would come true, then this would only be the beginning, then my millions would be taken from me too. No, no, no. My lovely, beautiful gold. I do not want to miss you. I'd rather die. I will defend it to the death." He had sunk into the heavy oak chair and was staring ahead, his hands opening and closing as if his fingers were twirling in the gold. Then he pressed his right hand to the hot forehead, leaning on the table with the other. With difficulty he got up and staggered to a cupboard in the wall that served as a buffet. He filled a wine glass with whiskey and emptied it in one gulp. Then he calmed down a bit. "Nonsense," said he, "my nerves are failing me. After all, it has not been decided that they are the same documents from the Buddha statue, and I probably find everything there in the greatest order. But I must go there. I want to be sure. And if they should be gone, at least my millions remain to me. But then I will no longer be thrifty and thrifty. I will then repay my dear nephew doubly for having had the sad courage to begin with me." He checked his revolver, picked up his electric flashlight, and made his way once more to the viceroy's tomb. All the boxes were empty. However much he groped and tossed in the individual sections, the documents and cases containing the princess's jewels were and remained missing. But it was curious, here in this subterranean vault the old man remained calmer than before, when he had no certainty of the disappearance of his treasures. With a curse he closed the Buddha statue again, took up his flashlight and left the tomb. There is no more doubt. Only he can know the secrets of the Caneroon castle, no one else. But take heed, nephew, now it's my turn. We shall see who is victorious in this battle. What can you do with your ingenuity, poor starving man, against your uncle's gold, which he will spend with full hands to make you harmless?" Scarcely returned from his subterranean journey, Lord Raynald had 4 ponies yoked to a light chariot, provided himself with travel money, and soon the young beasts were racing down the road to Dublin. In the secret compartment of Scotland Yard, Captain Baxter sat in a bad mood at his desk by the window, while Detective Mahome, hands behind his back, walked restlessly along the long table that stood in the center of the room. "It's going crazy, Mahome. That Raffles has disappeared without a trace." "Yes, and Lord Lister with him. I would like to know if I was mistaken. But there was not a word out of that servant, though I put all kinds of trick questions to him. He said he had been shopping near the Wester station. He did not know the villa in question at all, nor did Mr. Shaw. 25. All he knew of his master was that he was planning a journey around the world. As his master often went on journeys for months without confiding in him, he could not tell whether he was far away, or whether he was still in Paris or some other city. When his master returned, he would inform him that the police had asked for him. Then the Lord would not fail to clear things up. A crafty fellow. He's fooling us. The Lord will take heed to appear before us. You've been duped again, Mahome. It may be, but everything was done according to your orders, Captain. Baxter bit his lips. At least we now have some peace of mind from those eternal Raffles events. One is finally breathing again. Well, yes, but our searches of Raffles have come a long way. And let's not forget that Lord Lister is the same person as Raffles. So the affair with the servant does concern Raffles as well. Devil, you are right. Lister and Raffles are one and the same. It's about going crazy. The door to the right of the writing table was opened at this moment, and Detective Tyler entered with a business card in hand, which he gave to Captain Baxter. He had barely glanced at it when he turned dark red with surprise and motioned for Tyler to close the door. "Mahom," he whispered, panting, "the servant was right, he's coming." "Who, Lord Lister?" the other asked incredulously. The captain showed him the ticket. Mahom shrugged. "I do not understand that." Baxter pressed an electric button and police officers appeared through the doors leading to the adjoining rooms. "One at every door. The others are ready outside. Thou, Tyler, bring the gentleman in here and seize him as soon as he is in the room." "Mahom and I will receive it then." Such brutality. Also first a business card. "But are you not mistaken, Captain?" Tyler asked hesitantly. "I know what I'm doing, Tyler." "Hello. On your responsibility then, Captain." The detective disappeared into the side room as Baxter and Mahom stationed themselves at the door. No sooner had Lord Reynald Lister crossed the threshold than he felt himself gripped by 6 sturdy detective arms, and he was speechless. Only when he had been brought into the middle of the room and the full light fell on him did Mahom exclaim, "Stop! Watch out, Captain. After all, that's not Raffles or Lord Lister. This is a great old gentleman." The good captain realized his mistake and was silent. Lord Reynald, however, looked around furiously, until at last he found words for his indignation. "Raffles, Lord Lister?" he asked in surprise. "It's a mystery to me how those names can fit together. But I don't know what to say about such treatment. I will complain to the highest authorities. Have you all gone mad here for treating me so roughly? Surely I am Lord Lister. Have you not read my calling card?" Captain Baxter was inconsolable. He exhausted himself in the most submissive apologies and begged not to make a report. If he could serve his lordship, it would make him happy. The captain motioned for the other detectives to leave, which they gladly did, amused at the silly figure their boss was making. Baxter very politely presented a chair to Lord Reynald and bade him take a seat. "How did you come to this mistake, Captain? And what connection is there between Raffles and Lister? Your lordship will certainly not blame me when I give you the sad news that we are sadly to deal with a Lord Lister, a young man." "How could a Lister have sunk so low? Do you know the first name of that degenerate namesake?" "Very well, your lordship. If I am not mistaken, his name is Lord Edward." "Oh, I suspected it," exclaimed the hypocritical old lord in a wailing tone. "What a shame. That's my very own nephew. What has that bad luck fellow done? Oh, I am inconsolable." He wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and shook his head. "It pains me immensely," continued Captain Baxter, "to grieve your lordship still more. For it has been unequivocally proven that this Edward Lister and the notorious, well-known criminal Raffles are one and the same person." The old scoundrel could not prevent his eyes from shining with glee. But immediately afterwards he again played the part of the heartbroken kinsman. But in his heart the uncle felt happy, for he understood that he might now succeed in destroying his nephew, with the aid of Scotland Yard. He now told of the spectre of Caneroon Castle, and of the threat of the disguised princess to steal the lord's millions. He requested Captain Baxter to help him get them to a safe place and protect himself from the persecution of his degenerate cousin. Wisely, however, he kept silent about the disappearance of the jewels and documents, as he himself had stolen them and placed the blame on his brother, the Admiral. Captain Baxter promised all possible assistance. He would come to the castle himself with Mahom and 2 other detectives. The discussions had just ended, and Captain Baxter was only thinking of what days he had available when one of the officers came in with a telegram that he surrendered his superior. Baxter turned bright red as he read and slumped into a chair, powerless. Mahom, leaning over his shoulder, read the telegram with rising excitement. "Inspector of Police Baxter. Scotland Yard. Just returned from a splendidly successful show in the county. I am by appointment to inform you that the day after tomorrow evening at Caernarfon Castle near Dublin I will appropriate the ill-gotten millions of my uncle, Lord Reynald Lister. Your affectionate Raffles aka Lord Lister, the rightful owner of the above millions. What? Exclaimed Lord Reynald in a contrived tone of sadness. My millions taken illegally? Captain, you see I did not enlist your help a moment too soon. Will you let an old weak man, a lord of the kingdom, be robbed by a wicked cousin? Your lordship may be perfectly at ease, replied Baxter eagerly. This audacious criminal will not escape us now. If we don't catch him on the way, we will certainly catch him on your estate. Ghosts and Indian women don't impress Scotland Yard. Such ghosts cannot withstand our revolvers. Oh, that's a great reassurance, Captain. And it will do you no harm if you will help me in word and deed. Allow me already to meet you somewhat in the expenses of travel to Ireland. With a bleeding heart, he handed over 10 £5 bills. The latter, admittedly, claimed that it was far too much, but he accepted it wholeheartedly and promised to make his way with his people the next day via Holyhead and Dublin to Caernarfon Castle. Fully satisfied, and eager to be freed in a few days from his wicked cousin, Lord Reynald departed from Scotland Yard, and allowed himself the luxury of a good supper and a fine bottle. Chapter 8. Lord Edward's Measures and the Apprentice Air Traveller. Scarcely returned to London, Lord Edward had taken his heavy case to a trusted jeweller with the aid of the clean-shaven and unknowable Fred. The latter, who was acquainted with Lord Reynald's wickedness, joined hands when he learned that the old scoundrel had had the jewels in his possession, and was willing to keep them far from the claws of this bird of prey. As he had been Sir Edward's father's jeweller and knew the jewels very well, he valued them at 2,000,000 guilders and promised to sell them in Paris. For the time being he deposited them, gave them a receipt and handed them over to Lord Edward in the name of Mr. Shaw of Chicago, an advance of £500,000 to be paid by the Bank of England. Of this Lord Edward received the sum of £10,000, the rest he left in the bank for the time being, after he sent a telegram to the real Shaw in Chicago, who was a good friend of his after they had met in London had been notified. The answer came in the same way. The money was to be reserved for him and a letter of credit of the same amount was sent for him. More things were put in order by Lord Lister. A considerable sum was deposited by an unknown gentleman at the office of the Support Treasury of Invalid Workers, according to the morning papers the next day. Also from other charitable institutions, thanksgivings of more or less considerable sums appeared in the newspapers in those days. To her great surprise, a few days later Miss Helene Walton and her mother were summoned to accept a will. A distant relative in America, a certain Whitman, had left an inheritance to Helene, from which she could receive a monthly interest of £10, 120 guilders. Mrs. Walton, Helene's mother, could not recall having had a distant cousin in America, but the coin was nevertheless warmly welcomed by the two women. It was not possible for Lord Edward to be unemployed for long. Above all, however, he wanted to abolish the reproach that rested upon his father's memory. It was therefore necessary to discover the will, which his uncle seemed to have so well hidden, at all costs, because in it the disinheritance of the eldest son was revoked and he was fully restored to his honour. Then Lord Edward, too, had been the sole heir, to whom belonged the castle of Caernarfon and all that belonged to it, as well as his old uncle's millions. Lord Lister did not find Charlie at home. He did find a letter addressed to Mr. Shaw Sr., in which young Robert Shaw informed him that he was on a test balloon ride with engineer Huglach. The repairs to the balloon were completed and the new rudder and engines had already been prepared. As he read this letter, Lord Edward nodded in satisfaction. Famous. The boy is brave. Perhaps we can use this balloon, which we have paid dearly enough, soon. Huglach's easy-to-ride system is excellent. I think we have already mastered the matter. He took a taximeter near the villa and had arrived at the London Airships Clubhouse in a few minutes, just in time to attend the landing of the airship Nike, which, beyond all expectation, soared beautifully into the open garage. When Huglach left the boat with Charlie, he literally beamed with happiness. In the presence of the enthusiastic fellow members of the club, he repeatedly embraced Robert Bentley Shaw of Chicago. "You are an aviation genius, my young American friend. The devil may fetch me, if you have not already surpassed your teacher." Mr. Shaw, I predict, if no misfortune befalls you before, you will probably become the greatest airshipman of the 20th century. Already now I would entrust myself to your leadership with the greatest confidence. The London Club owes it chiefly to its genius member, Mr. Robert Bentley Shaw, of Chicago, that this trial has ended so extremely happily. And to the immortal inventor Huglupch, cried a mockingbird in a louder voice. Lord Edward was delighted. With old Shaw's venerable countenance, he pushed through the crowd and warmly congratulated his nephew. To the chagrin of all present, however, he at the same moment invited his nephew to join him for supper. The fine restaurant of Buxley, the gathering place of the London aristocracy, was already exceedingly crowded. The clattering of plates, the popping of corks and the clinking of glasses were heard everywhere. The two pseudo-Americans sought a cozy place by the balustrade of an elevation, from where they had an overview of the hall and audience. As the black-skirt waiter rushed over with zeal, Mr. Shaw presented him with a business card, on which he had written his table number, speaking in genuine Yankee dialect. For the doorman. When the captain of police Baxter comes, whom he will know, he must hand him this ticket. Very well, sir, replied the waiter in a submissive tone, and already he rushed off. Charlie looked with such puzzled eyes that Lister laughed. I have just sent him our car and an invitation to supper. I don't think he'll turn it down. But Uncle Shaw, isn't that actually defying the gods? Well, no. The captain talks so pleasantly, Lister replied in a sarcastic tone. I'd love to hear him tell a little about Raffles. And wouldn't it also interest you if he once explained to us how he intends to catch this criminal? Yes, dear cousin, I will of course have to wait and see if my curiosity will be satisfied. But I should like to know from you, the newfound genius, whether you would dare to land on the tower of an old castle in a dark night with your balloon? On top of that tower, as is so often found in our country, is a pair of binoculars with a bricked-in-iron triangular pedestal. I think, dear uncle, that with the aid of electric light, which need only be used for a moment, and would be doable with our anchor. The iron triangular pedestal would be a good point to tie the anchor to. Lord Lister whispered something in Charlie's ear. The eyes of the American cousin glittered. Uncle Shaw. Shh, my boy. I understand you. Here he comes. Scarcely had the waiter ordered the tortoise-shell soup and uncorked a fine bottle of Medoc, when the broad figure of the captain, dressed in impeccable civilian attire, approached the table of the two Americans. Messrs. Shaw rose and welcomed him warmly. Captain Baxter looked pleased. Eating and drinking were his weak side. With a sigh of satisfaction at meeting these two jovial and wealthy Americans, he sat on the wicker chair, after which he took a long gulp from the glass shoved to him by Shaw. Devilish! He exclaimed, that's a fine brand. I'm glad he likes you, replied Mr. Shaw, it's good old Medoc. Captain Baxter paid full respect to the table. The tortoise-shell soup, the fish, the roast pigeons with goose liver sauce and asparagus, the pudding and the finely seasoned cheese, all were in great demand and, like the Medoc, disappeared with unprecedented speed. The cheeks of Mr. Baxter's eyes were dark red when Mr. Shaw finally ordered 2 more bottles of champagne to be placed in the ice. In addition, the millionaire presented real imported Havanas from his own plantations, and gradually the captain got into a very friendly, communicative mood. And when Mr. Shaw once inquired, "Now, Mr. Baxter, what are the latest reports of this arch-scale Raffles?" he did not hesitate for a moment to tell that impudent thief had written again and announced a new crime which he intended to commit. It now concerned the robbery of a high-ranking lord in the county, at Caneroon Castle in Ireland. But he would be present with his best helpers and take his measures in such a way that the shameful criminal could not escape him now. Lord Edward would not know anything more. He still inquired about the appointed time, and let the chatty captain tell the story. When they parted, Baxter continued to keep the opened bottle company. The captain had promised to send Mr. Shaw to announce the outcome of the great undertaking. Chapter 9. A disappeared airship and Lord Raynald's attachments. 2 days later, the London Air Travellers Club held an extraordinary meeting in the evening. Among the items on the agenda were the all-important announcement of the royal gift from Messrs. Shaw from Chicago, as well as the report of the repair of the airship, the introduction of the new steering engine and of the wonderfully successful trial run. In order to give some further explanations, the brilliant inventor of the new system invited Messrs. members to visit with him the large building used for the storage of the balloons, in order to show them the advantages of the Untitled system itself. To set out. All followed with interest the inventor, who smiled silently at the prospect of great triumphs. After all had entered the spacious hall, he turned on the electric light and was dumb with horror. There was no airship to be seen anywhere. Everything was investigated, to no avail. Untitled telephoned Scotland Yard and some detectives were sent by car. But Captain Baxter had gone to the province with several inspectors to protect a distinguished gentleman from a premeditated theft, so this astute official could not appear in person. Not the slightest trace was found, however. The ropes were untied, the gas tanks emptied, and the anchors were also missing. In short, the modern and curious fact was established and accepted as the only possibility, that the London Club's airship had been stolen. In the castle of Caneroon there was great bustle and movement. Captain Baxter had arrived with his helpers. He'd brought Mahome, Tyler, and a few lesser-known younger detectives. Lord Reynald had a lengthy interview with them, and it was agreed not to leave the money and papers of value in the safe in the hall, as they would not be safe there from a criminal like Raffles. Where could one take the Lord's treasures? The detectives searched the whole castle from top to bottom. They, too, had climbed the tower, and had explored it to the top, where a hatch led to an iron spiral staircase. As a souvenir of a Lord Lister who had done astronomy, here was another large telescope on a bricked iron tripod, at which point the telescope could be moved in a circular manner. On the walls beneath the carved pewter were large, strong, ironclad cabinets in which the astronomical lord had kept his scientific instruments. It was now Mahome's idea to hide the treasures up here where no one would suspect them. Lord Reynald rubbed his hands. The plan seemed exceedingly good to him, and so they immediately set to work to take all the sacks full of gold and the packs of banknotes from the safe and store them in the strong cupboards upstairs. When everything had been put in the cupboards and the detectives had their meal, Lord Lister merely went up to the tower again, looked carefully about him, and placed a fairly large place setting with the valuable papers. This last piece of paper had to be the most valuable of all papers. Lord Reynald Lister was now reassured. He knew that his treasures were kept in such a way that his nephew could not possibly get them, well guarded as they were by the most famous detectives of the secret police. By pressing an electric button on his right hand, he was able to call them to him immediately, should the need arise. But already evening had come, and no Raffles appeared. The Lord no longer believed in the coming of Lord Edward. He suspected that the writing to Scotland Yard had been nothing but a brash twaddle to fool Captain Baxter. Besides, he had his revolver ready, close to him was his rifle case. Besides the bell and the detectives, what did he have to fear? He had sat down in an armchair and was just about to have a good supper and a glass of old wine served, when a strange crackling caught his attention. His eyes grew unnaturally large and his lower jaw dropped. He was about to faint from shock and had to lean back in his chair. The life-size portrait of the Eastern princess had disappeared, and in the vacant opening stood with a mocking smile on his face a slender gentleman in a black silk half-mask and immaculate cylinder, pointing a pistol at the startled lord. "Good evening, most honored uncle," cried the masked man in a mocking tone. "Sit still for the time being, and don't make the slightest movement, or I'll blow you out of life without any pangs of conscience. Understood?" The masked man leapt onto the oak bench below the portrait, and a few seconds later found himself facing his uncle, whose forehead was covered in cold sweat. "Ah, you wretched scoundrel, usurer, get up now. Watch out, because at the slightest suspicious movement, a bullet from this silent weapon will penetrate your heart. Well, it's better I take that revolver from you. He might tempt you into useless opposition and cost you your life. I wouldn't want that." He calmly took the revolver from the right pocket of his coat and put the weapon in his hand. "Now go on, uncle. You sure have the keys with you. Come on, villain, or your last hour has come." The thought of the empty safe gave the old lord his reflection. A mocking grin twisted the deathly pale face. But Raffles had noticed this change and made his inference. "The safe is empty." Carefully. "The old scoundrel is beyond terror," he thought. "What's your plan anyway?" asked Lord Reynald in a hoarse tone. "Do you want to rob and kill me? It would only be a just punishment for your crimes." but I have not come to answer your questions. Come on, to the safe." The old criminal glanced for a moment at the button of the electric bell, and then staggered to the fireproof cupboard built into the wall beside the sideboard. He hesitated for a moment and then took the key from his pocket. "A little faster, sir. Do I have to help you?" Lord Reynald opened the cupboard and Raffles saw that his suspicion was correct. The stolen millions have been rescued. That doesn't hinder. Raffles will find them, even if they were hidden on the tin of the tower." This proverb thrown loosely made the old man pale and tremble again. Lord Edward looked at him intently. "My main concern at the moment is the will, that I may restore my father to his honor." "Rogue, where's the will? Where is my grandfather's will? For the day with it or you die." Lord Edward seized the sinking loan shark by the throat and pressed the cold steel of the revolver to his forehead. Lord Reynald thought his last moment had come. A gurgling sound came out of his throat. He strained his last strength to escape the hands of his nephew, and in a shrieking voice he shouted, "Baxter, Marhome, help! Help!" He wanted to rush to the electric bell, but his feet refused him the service. He had to hold on to the safe door, and there he sank to his knees. But the house had already become lively. The detectives must have heard the old man's cry, for they came down the stairs in great leaps. "Was dog, take this already!" cried Lord Edward, slapping his nefarious uncle against his temple in Japanese fashion with the narrow side of his hand, leaving Lord Reynald motionless before his empty safe. Baxter and Marhome appeared on the stairs to the left of the statue of the princess. "Good evening, Captain. How are you?" asked Raffles with the greatest composure. "I hope we'll have you in our hands in a few minutes, you damned scoundrel," came the not very courteous reply. At those words, Baxter ran to meet him, to grab him along with Marhome. For a moment Lister hesitated, then with a lightning movement he thrust his pistol into one of his pockets, turned to Marhome, and struck the chin with such force that the detective rolled unconscious on the carpet. In the same instant he turned to Baxter. With his chest and head bent forward, he rushed into Baxter's belly with such speed that it tumbled backwards with a terrible curse and landed next to his friend Marhome. Now the way was clear, and, remembering his uncle's terror and his appointment with Charlie, he sprang upon the table and from there, with a deft swing, into the niche of the princess's portrait. But already the old lord and Baxter had recovered from their light stupor. "The portrait! The portrait!" shouted the old rich man. "The opening must lead to the tower, up the stairs." Baxter just saw his mortal enemy Raffles disappear into the opening. Then a cracking sound was heard, and behind the missing master thief stood again the painted portrait of the Indian Queen on the wall. "Come on, Captain!" exclaimed the old lord, "or he escaped through the tower and the park. Come on, Marhome. If you catch him, I'll pay a princely wage." When they opened the door they could just see how Lord Edward had already reached the top of the stairs. Lord Reynald did not suspect that his nephew had understood where the new hiding place of the millions was. "He wants to hide in the tower. Captain, now we have him. He plunges himself into ruin." All three, along with some servants, who stood ready armed at the command of the Lord, rushed up the stairs. Soon they had reached the spiral staircase, and Baxter, clutching the revolver tightly in his right hand, crept silently upstairs. Behind him came the loving uncle. "Now you will not escape us again, dear cousin. Here you will find no way out, my dear. You could only jump down from the platform, if you don't want to get caught and save the honor of our family name." "I will and will, dear uncle. But first I have one little thing to trade here. Let none of you, if he loves his life, crawl through the trapdoor of the spiral staircase." One could hear running and jumping up there, and yet the old lord grew queer at the thought of the millions hidden there. But how could Raffles know, and besides, how could he bring them down? "Come on, Captain. Onward, Marhome," he urged, "otherwise he will discover the hiding place, and you know that my cousin Raffles is in contact with the devil." Truly, Baxter now decided to go upstairs with a contempt of death. Marhome followed closely behind. But they encountered no opposition, much to their own surprise. With a curious sense of being ambushed, they entered through the opening of the spiral staircase onto the platform where pitch-black night reigned, expecting at any moment to be attacked. But none of this happened. Suddenly a bright electric light shone, and in its glare the three men saw a gigantic hot air balloon rising perpendicular to the tower. It was the vanished steerable balloon of the London Club. Lord Edward waved into the boat with a document and cried, "Old scoundrel, here I have my grandfather's will for so long missing, in which you are disinherited and my father is restored. And here, you fool, usurer, sucker, here beside me in the barge lie the treasures which I stole from you. We finally discovered them and were able to load them without much effort." The criminal old lord clutched his throat with both hands, and with a gurgling sound he fell motionless. Higher and higher, however, soared the magnificent airship, which set course for the east. Several bullets were sent to him in vain, the balloon was already too far away. He carried Raffles, the master thief of genius, far from the scene of his latest and most just deed, to the east, to the great English metropolis. The next part, number 11, will contain Sunken Treasures. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.